Part 7. Book quote reading from My Zen Mind Balcony. Dr. Allan Schore, Right Brain Psychotherapy.
Dr. Allan Schore is on the clinical faculty of the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine. He is the author of 6 seminal volumes, including The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy, and actually, not 6 now, 8, 2 just published books, Right Brain Psychotherapy and The Development of the Unconscious Mind, as well as numerous peer-reviewed articles and chapters. Dr. Schore's contributions appear in multiple disciplines, including neuroscience, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, psychiatry, developmental psychology, attachment theory, trauma studies, and that's an abbreviated list.
My work in interpersonal neurobiology characterizes the implicit right lateralized brain, mind, body, and more we're now seeing not just brain, but brain, mind, body mechanisms that operate unconsciously in these therapeutic change processes. Right temporal parietal cortex, this junction, back of the brain, right side, is known to be activated in social interactions and is centrally involved always in states of face and voice processing. Think psychotherapy now. It's also centrally involved in attention at to what one is focusing attention on, in perceptual awareness and empathy, empathic understanding. This right TPO integrates the input from visual, facial, auditory, tone of voice, somasthetic, gestural, and also emotional limbic areas, and is thus a pivotal neural locus for functions of the self. Indeed, the right temporal parietal occipital areas, synchronized in 2 partners, allows for making sense of another's mind. This following figure I'm going to show is the right lateralized interbrain synchronization. These 2 brains are operating at the same rate simultaneously, back and forth together, adjusting as they're moving, as the information is coming in. And they also represent, I'm going to suggest here, a spontaneous right brain to right brain communication between one subjective self and another. Note the mutual gaze. So this is what it looks like. We're looking top down on these brains. On the brain on the left, you see the activation in the right hemisphere and the brain on the right, and they are with face to face with each other, eye to eye with each other, etc. You see the synchronization in the right hemispheres of both of these individuals. Right brain to right brain. In 2001, I applied this synchronization model to the psychotherapy context. And I said the attuned, intuitive clinician, from the first point of contact, is learning the nonverbal moment-to-moment rhythmic structures of the patient's internal states, the crescendos and the decrescendos of arousal, and is flexibly and fluidly modifying her own behavior to synchronize with that structure, thereby creating a context for the organization of the Therapeutic Alliance. My colleague Russell Mears in Australia describes a form of therapeutic conversation that can be conceived as a dynamic interplay between right hemispheres. This theme of synchronized right brain to right brain communications appears at the core of each chapter of this new volume, Right Brain Psychotherapy. In this book, I describe the neurobiological mechanisms, the interpersonal neurobiological mechanisms of affective communications, of attachment dynamics between the patient and the therapist. I also describe relational trauma, which is also a right brain phenomenon, transference, countertransference, and interactive affect regulation, all in a right brain model, all including right brain to right brain communications between the therapist and the patient.
The latest groundbreaking interdisciplinary work from one of our most eloquent and significant writers about emotion and the brain. The Therapeutic Alliance, which is defined as the collaborative bond between patient and therapist, and now considered as the quintessential integrative variable. Furthermore, they stressed the need for interbrain connectivity between the patient and the therapist, especially for early detection and repair of rupture of the Therapeutic Alliance. Over the past 3 decades, a major focus of my own work in interpersonal neurobiology has been on the synchronized, right lateralized interbrain communication of emotions within the co-constructed attachment relationship embedded in the Therapeutic Alliance. At present, functional neuroimaging is on the brink of another paradigm shift, quantifying the brain interactions between individuals transcending the boundary of the skull. Thus, a more complex understanding of brain activity requires framing it in an interpersonal context, as can now be done in interbrain connectivity analysis in functional neuroimaging. Among all forms of interbrain communications, the communication of emotion is the most important process to mental health. They then offered clinical applications of this new and state-of-the-art multi-brain functional neuroimaging methodology. These authors documented paradigm shifts in neuroimaging from the late 20th century to present. The primary research strategy for the period of the first appearance of neuroimaging technology was the localization of a specific brain function, in particular brain regions, and the intrabrain focus of these studies was on brain activity during sensory, motor, or cognitive tasks. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a shift of the reference frame from brain regions to the whole brain, accompanied by use of functional connectivity analysis. In further support of this model of right lateralized interbrain synchronization, functional neuroimaging research is now exploring the critical role of the right hemisphere in adult social interactions. Indeed, live face-to-face interaction during fMRI shows greater activation in brain regions involved in social cognition and reward, including the right temporoparietal junction, anterior cingulate cortex, right superior temporal sulcus, ventral striatum, and amygdala. In another study, brain mechanisms underlying human communication, Nordsey and colleagues offered research demonstrating that planning new communicative actions by a sender and recognizing the communicative intention of the same actions by a receiver relied on spatially overlapping portions of their brains, specifically the right posterior superior temporal sulcus, PSTS, the response of this region was lateralized to the right hemisphere, modulated by the ambiguity in meaning of the communicative acts. Part 7. Book quote reading from my Zen Mind Balcony. Right Brain Psychotherapy by Allan, Schore. Via this right lateralized system, the sender of a communicative signal uses his own intention recognition system to make a prediction of the intention recognition performed by the receiver. Importantly, interpersonal synchronization occurred only in pairs with shared communicative history. These authors documented that in this non-verbal, intersubjective communication, the processing of novelty and meaning is generated in the right and not left hemisphere. In a previous work using magnetoencephalography, this laboratory documented neural activity in the right temporal lobe and right ventromedial cortex, both limbic structures, when two individuals generate and understand novel shared symbols during live communicative interactions. Note that the data of these studies are directly relevant to right brain clinician-patient.
Ian McGilchrist, a neuropsychiatrist from Britain, in his classic book, The Master and His Emissary, points out that the differences between the two cerebral hemispheres is profound. Each, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, have a distinct mode of functioning and create coherent, utterly different, and often incompatible versions of the world with competing priorities and values. So at this point in time, we're not thinking about two halves of one brain, but dual cortical subcortical systems with unique structures and functions. And this lays out very nicely into a left hemispheric rational brain and a right hemispheric emotional brain. A linguistic brain on the left versus a social brain on the right. Implicit versus explicit self systems, and conscious minds versus unconscious minds. And the theme here for many years is that the right brain is the psychobiological substrate of the unconscious mind.
It was obvious to me that, if I'm right, that the world comes into being differently for the two halves of the brain because they pay different attention. And the kind of attention you pay alters what you find, and it alters you. It's a reciprocal effect. And so it really meant thinking about, not just in abstract terms about the difference between the hemispheres, and not just about the historical way in which this has played out in the history of Western Europe, which I dealt with in the second part of The Master and His Emissary, but really about the most basic questions: who are we? What is the world? And what is our relationship with the cosmos? Small questions, eh? So that's why it's a big book. But it seems to me very important because I don't have to mention, obviously, the terrific problems that we face, the business of the assault on nature, the devastation of the way of life of indigenous peoples all over the world. And even, it seems to me, that we are now rapidly committing suicide as a civilization. We're doing everything we can to destroy what is best about it. These are very serious problems, but if there's one thing that's more serious, it's about the philosophy of who we are and what the world is that underlies all those problems. It's because we don't have a proper idea at all of who we are or of what the world is, that we've got ourselves into these situations. And even if we could get out of those situations, it wouldn't be any good if we carried on thinking and behaving in the same way. So we have to change. Yeah. And it's my attempt to explain why the way that we have often been told to think about ourselves and the world, which is a materialist, reductionist account, that effectively the world is an inert mechanism, that we human beings are the playthings of chance, that we are basically programmed to compete with one another to the death. All of this is completely wrong, not just philosophically, but it has no basis in science. Science doesn't compel you to believe any of this. It's a philosophy that has hijacked the sane and dignified voice of science. And it's very loud these days in a lot of the public voices of science, and not just science, of politics and beyond. So what I'm trying to do is to show, first of all, that this is a very unusual way to think about the world. And when you look at how the two halves of the brain conceive the world, you can see that this is deeply skewed towards a certain viewpoint, which is the one that the left hemisphere holds. So we must believe there is some kind of a truth. It's how do we access it? So there is a core reality. Now, how do we get any kind of portals on that? Any sort of ways in which we can look into that reality and take it on board? Well, I believe that the main ones would be, probably we could argue about the detail, but they're probably things like attention in the first place. If you don't attend in a certain way, you won't find anything there. And the way you attend alters what you find. Then there's perception, which is not the same as attention, but is obviously related to attention. And then thirdly, there's the judgments that we form, both on our attention and our perception. And those judgments in turn are informed by our emotional and social intelligence and by our cognitive intelligence, good old-fashioned IQ, and by our capacity for creative thinking. These are the ways in which we get to grips with and understand reality at the most basic level. I take each of these at a time and show that the right hemisphere is better able to use these and uses them more intelligently than the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is prone to delusions. So the subtitle of my book is Our Brains Are Delusions and the Unmaking of the World, because that's what I believe we're doing. We're unmaking the world with our brains. Our brains are there to make the world, but we're using them now to destroy the world. Quite simply, the right hemisphere is more reliable. In other words, we would get caught out by reality much more often if we trusted in the world according to the left hemisphere. We would believe all kinds of crazy things, and we suddenly find that life was unlivable because we simply weren't in touch with it. Whereas if we believe largely what the right hemisphere believes, we've got an in on reality. Now know what the signature or the hallmark of a left hemisphere take on something is. And if we want to avoid being mistakenly taken by a paradigm, by a take on the world, if we wish to avoid being mistaken, it's good for us to know whether this kind of a way of looking at the world is likely to come from the right hemisphere or from the left, because we can establish that the right hemisphere is more veridical.
With respect to the paradigm shift toward relationally oriented psychotherapy, clinical interpersonal neurobiological models of therapeutic change are now moving from left brain to right brain, from the mind to the body, and from the central to the autonomic nervous system. This shift in paradigm into relational models of psychotherapy is being paralleled in social neuroscience studies. of the essential role of the right brain in social interaction. Indeed, there is now a call to move from a classical one-brain neuroscience toward a novel two-body approach. Dumas' paradigm shift parallels the ongoing theoretical and clinical transformation from a one-person psychology of an auto-regulating isolated brain to a two-person psychology of an interactively regulating brain. Indeed, in this current decade, hyperscanning methodologies utilizing simultaneous electroencephalography (EEG), functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI), near-infrared spectroscopy (NIRS), and magnetoencephalography (MEG) measurements have been created. This technological advance now allows the study of two brains in real-time social interactions with each other, including during rapid emotional communications. Dumas and his colleagues reported simultaneous measurements of brain activities of each member of a dyad during interpersonal communications, where both participants are continuously active, each modifying their own actions in response to the continuously changing actions of their partner. Inspired by studies of non-verbal communication and coordination between a mother and her infant, and by research on spontaneous imitation in pre-verbal infants, these authors offered a dual EEG study of interbrain synchronization during a spontaneous social interaction characterized by reciprocal communication and turn-taking. In this relational context, both share attention and compare cues of self and others' actions. They reported specific changes in both brains during nonverbal imitation and central foundation of socialization and communication, specifically an interbrain synchronization of the right centroparietal regions on a milliseconds timescale in both interacting partners. Furthermore, these researchers documented that the right temporoparietal cortex in one partner is synchronized with the right temporoparietal cortex of the other. They pointed out that the right temporoparietal TPO junction is known to be activated in social interactions and is centrally involved in states of attention processing, perceptual awareness, face and voice processing, and empathic understanding. The right TPO junction integrates input from visual, auditory, somesthetic, and limbic areas, and is thus a pivotal neural locus for self-functions. This right lateralized system also allows for making sense of another mind. Figure 1.1 shows this interbrain synchronization lateralized to the right hemispheres of each member of a communicating dyad. Neuroscience itself has been undergoing a paradigm shift. This paradigm shift is expressed in advances in brain research from previous studies of a single brain to recent technologies that allow for simultaneous measurement of two brains interacting with each other in real time. I will suggest that the current shift from a one-person to a two-person theoretical perspective can generate an overarching integrated model of the interactive relationships of the dual brain hemispheres and of the unconscious and conscious minds. Social interactions between brains shape emotional circuits within brains, especially in early critical periods when brain circuits are maturing. More specifically, I continue to offer evidence in this book, Right Brain Psychotherapy, and the companion volume, The Development of the Unconscious Mind, that emotional interactions reflect right brain to right brain affective communication in early development, where the mother shapes limbic autonomic circuits in the infant's early developing right hemisphere. The essential right brain functions of communication and interactive regulation thus refer to two-person psychobiological interaction as expressed in dynamic interpersonal and intersubjective contexts. An interpersonal neurobiology of human development enables us to understand that the structure and function of the mind and brain are shaped by experiences, especially those involving emotional relationships, and to understand the relational mechanisms by which communicating brains align and synchronize their neural activities with other brains. Actually, the latter principle of interbrain synchronization is more fundamental. It acts as an underlying reciprocal psychoneurobiological mechanism by which minds and brains are shaped by other minds and brains. Presented in London as the 7th Annual John Bowlby Memorial Lecture, I applied my right brain to right brain model to the co-construction of a synchronized emotional communication system in the therapeutic relationship. The attuned intuitive clinician from the first point of contact is learning the non-verbal moment-to-moment rhythmic structures of the patient's internal states, and is relatively flexible and fluidly modifying her own behavior to synchronize with that structure, thereby creating a context for the organization of the Therapeutic Alliance. In addition, note the commonality with my characterization of synchronized right brain to right brain state sharing in psychotherapy. Dynamically fluctuating moment-to-moment state sharing represents an organized dialogue occurring within milliseconds and acts as an interactive matrix in which both partners match states and then simultaneously adjust their social attention, stimulation, and accelerating arousal in response to their partner's signals. Note the similarity of this description of reciprocal right brain to right brain psychotherapeutic state sharing and Dumas and colleagues' reciprocal right lateralized interbrain synchronization, in which both participants are continuously active, each modifying their own actions in response to the continuously changing actions of their partner. It is this two-person, synchronized, right brain to right brain implicit emotional communication and affect regulation that lies at the core of the right brain change mechanisms of psychotherapy, underscoring their fundamental role in the psychotherapeutic repair of the self. The centrality of these interpersonal neurobiological mechanisms is reflected in the large body of research, now stretching over decades, that indicates the Therapeutic Alliance is the best predictor of outcome across a wide range of psychotherapeutic modalities. Self, as a form of consciousness, cannot exist in isolation. It arises from a brain state, but a brain, seen as a system isolated from the world, is an abstraction. It is always interacting with the environment, of which, when speaking of self, the social environment is the most important part. Indeed, he now describes the prime therapeutic aim to be right hemisphere integration, and citing my work suggests that the therapeutic conversation can be conceived as a dynamic interplay between two right hemispheres. In a research study toward a neural basis of interactive alignment in conversation, Menenti, Pickering, and Garrett 2012 pointed out that language alone is not sufficient to have a proper conversation, and that alignment of non-linguistic processes and turn-taking is necessary to keep a conversation going. They concluded that body posture, prosody, and gesture are vital aspects of conversation and are taken into account effortlessly when trying to infer what a speaker intends. According to Jasmine and colleagues, both participants in a conversation tend to change their postures and fixate their gazes at around the same time, and this alignment aids mutual understanding. Over time, the creative clinician, sensitive to even low levels of the patient's shift into and out of affective states, learns how to fluidly synchronize this shift in hemispheric dominance with the patient shifts. The right lateralized interbrain synchronization allows for the communication and regulation of not just conscious but unconscious affects. The relational trend in psychotherapy, of course, had evolved because of the contributions of earlier psychoanalytic theoreticians, including Ferenczi, Fairbairn, Sullivan, Kohut, Mitchell, and most recently Bromberg. Over the same time, in parallel to psychotherapy, the relational perspective had also progressed within both developmental psychology and developmental neuroscience, especially in the recently created transdisciplinary field of interpersonal neurobiology. The organizing principle of this developmental relational conception dictates that the self-organization of the developing brain occurs in the context of a relationship with another self, another brain. For 2 decades, I have elaborated and expanded regulation theory to model the development, psychopathogenesis, and treatment of the right brain implicit self. Thus, in 1994 and 2001, I outlined the relational origins of secure attachment and created the construct of relational trauma, which induces dissociation and emotional disconnection from self and other. The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy, 2012. I have argued that more so than the interpretation and cognitive insight, relational affective processes between patient and therapist are at the core of the change mechanism. A major purpose of regulation theory is to construct more complex theoretical models that can generate both heuristic experimental research and clinically relevant conceptions of human development, including progressions of development in growth-promoting psychotherapy. My studies on the interpersonal neurobiology of the relational construct of the Therapeutic Alliance, the collaborative bond between therapist and patient, indicate that therapist-patient relational communications operate rapidly beneath levels of conscious awareness, while my research in developmental neuropsychoanalysis describes the early evolution of a relational unconscious and a right lateralized social brain that represents the biological substrate of the human unconscious. The left side is involved with conscious response and the right with the unconscious mind. Regulation theory thus strongly supports currently evolving psychodynamic models of psychotherapy, especially in the treatment of early forming attachment trauma. Throughout my work, I have offered a large body of research and clinical data that underscore the centrality of evolutionary mechanism of early attachment bonding for all later aspects of human development, especially adaptive socio-emotional functions essential for survival. Building upon and expanding John Bowlby's pioneering studies that integrated psychology, biology, and psychoanalysis, modern attachment theory incorporates current advances in developmental and affective neuroscience in order to offer an overarching theoretical model of interpersonal psycho-neurobiological attachment dynamics. Early interactive dysregulation represents a central source of the psychopathology that brings the patient into psychotherapy. Clinicians across all forms of psychotherapy are now utilizing updated attachment models in the treatment of right brain relational emotional dysfunctions of every psychiatric disorder. I now present a succinct summary of my work in the neurobiology of attachment, first proposed in 1994 and subsequently expanded over the past 2 decades. A central principle of regulation theory dictates that attachment is the relational unfolding of an evolutionary mechanism, and that the essential developmental task of the first 2 years of human infancy is the co-creation of an attachment bond of emotional communication and regulation between the infant and the primary caregiver. Building upon prenatal communications between mother and fetus in ensuing perinatal and postnatal periods, affective transactions are rapidly transmitted within the dyad, using more and more complex non-verbal sensory affective communications in order to facilitate this relational emotional mechanism. The mother must be psychobiologically attuned to the dynamic shift in the infant's bodily-based internal states of central and autonomic arousal. Although initially these communications are expressed in olfactory, gustatory, and tactile modalities, by the end of the second month, the dyad utilizes more integrated visual and auditory channels of communications in mutual gaze episodes. During dyadic synchronized reciprocal attachment transactions, the sensitive primary caregiver, at levels beneath conscious awareness, perceives, recognizes, appraises, and regulates nonverbal expressions of the infant's more and more intense states of positive and negative affective arousal. Via these communications, the mother regulates the infant's postnatally developing central CNS and autonomic ANS nervous systems. The attachment relationship thus mediates the dyadic regulation of bodily-based emotional states. In this ongoing, co-created dialogue, the good enough mother and her infant co-construct multiple cycles of both affect synchrony that upregulates positive affect, e.g. joy, elation, interest, excitement, and rupture and repair that downregulates negative affect, e.g. fear, terror, sadness, depression, shame, disgust. These cycles of intersubjective and intrasubjective attunement, misattunement, reattunement represent a pre-verbal psychobiological relational matrix that forms the core of the infant's emerging implicit corporal self. Modern attachment theory defines emotional well-being as non-conscious yet efficient and resilient, switching between these two models, interconnectedness and autonomy, depending on the relational context. Internal working models of attachment encode both of these modes of coping strategies of affect regulation. At the most fundamental level, modern attachment theory is a regulation theory. Synchronized, affectively charged relational attachment dynamics represent the biopsychological mechanism by which we are socio-physiologically connected to others in order to co-regulate our internal homeostatic affective states. The evolutionary mechanism of attachment, the interactive regulation of emotion, thus represents the regulation of biological synchronicity between the within organisms. Bradshaw and Schore, 2007, Schore, 1994. At this point, I want to recommend the Therapist Uncensored YouTube channel. If you want to learn about attachment styles, go to this channel and watch these videos. I will put the link in the description in the right order, because these ladies really explain attachment style in understandable way. So even if you don't know anything about attachment, you just listen to these videos and then you understand what this is all about. A while ago, attachment theory was a special interest of mine when I investigated the trauma and complex PTSD, and I did a later video arguing that maybe autistics should have a separate attachment style, and there is a good video about this also by Donna Williams. She explains how autistics can attach in a different way when it is not about the eye contact, but more about objects and the voice and things like that. It's a very interesting video too, if you are interested in autistic attachment. So I recommend you watch all these videos. It's really worth it because it's a crash course in attachment styles. And you learn about avoidant dismissive, preoccupational anxious, as well as disorganized chaotic attachment style. At all points of the lifespan, interactive psychobiological regulation supports the survival functions of the right lateralized human implicit self system. This principle is echoed in developmental brain research, where Ovtcharov and Brown reported the dyadic interaction between the newborn and the mother serves as a regulator of the developing individual's internal homeostasis. The regulatory function of the newborn-mother interaction may be an essential promoter to ensure the normal development and maintenance of synaptic connections during the establishment of functional brain circuits. In this manner, dyadic attachment regulatory transactions impact the development of psychic structure, that is, they generate brain development. More and more complex right lateralized visual, facial, auditory, prosodic and tactile, gestural, nonverbal, implicit, affective communications lie at the psychobiological core of the emotional attachment bond between the infant and primary caregiver. Implicit processing underlies the quick and automatic handling of nonverbal affective cues in infancy and is repetitive, automatic, provides quick categorization and decision-making, and operates outside the realm of focal attention and verbalized experience. Lyon Ruth, 1999. The synchronization of the mother's responses to the infant's signals is a key aspect of the mother's embodied and pre-reflective sensitivity, expressed in the promptness of her response to immediate moment-to-moment changes in the child's emotional states. Can the therapeutic peer with a shared communication history retain a right brain to right brain interpersonal interbrain synchronization? In other words, will the clinician implicitly retain a system of state sharing and remain psychobiologically connected to the patient so that she can not only share but also interactively regulate the dysregulated affective state? Can they both hold in the right? At the most fundamental level, the implicit change mechanism must include a conscious or unconscious affective experience communicated to an empathic other. As these interactions might give expression to dissociated, painful, angry and defensive self-states, the empathic aspect in enactments do not depend on the therapist's ability to experience empathy for the patient's difficulties. The empathic component is found in the therapist's readiness and ability to resonate with what is not verbalized, but non-consciously transmitted nonetheless. Arguably the most painful, socially debilitating and ignored affective experience is shame, signaling a threat to the social self. Shame is manifested as an excruciating psychophysiological effect with thoughts of worthlessness and inferiority, and an immediate desire to hide, cover up, or transform the feeling, e.g. into anger, to reduce its impact on the self. Dissociative phenomena may have affect regulation value, reducing the emotional impact of painful feelings by creating psychological distance. Note that shame can be covered up, that is, held within, but defensively blocked from consciousness, yet also that shame can be transformed into anger. The well-known state of shame rage, predominant in narcissistic personality disorders. Indeed, shame has long been known to be associated with anger. But what neurobiological mechanism allows for this shift from a passive intrapersonal to an active interpersonal state? A major neurophysiological attribute of the parasympathetic dominant shame system is its ability to couple with other sympathetic dominant emotions, including the emotional output of the aggression motivational system, anger. In other words, in the self-state of shame, aggression can be turned inward to the self, internalizing psychopathologies, or turned outward in an attack other shame defense, externalizing psychopathologies. Doherty observed that the aggressive response to shame may reflect the uninitiated rage reaction toward the original etiological humiliating figure that was never expressed and was subsequently turned toward the self. Alice Miller has written a lot about this in her books. At some later point I will also introduce her books. Her probably most famous book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, was a true game changer when I read it as a teenager. I understood what had happened to me during childhood. Especially in cases with a history of relational humiliation, both unconscious non-verbal shame dynamics and unconscious verbal shame rage dynamics will appear in stressful therapeutic transference, countertransference, bad self, psychodynamics, potentially triggering counter-transferential attack other defenses in the therapist. Hate in the counter-transference, thus the therapist's ability to detect in the patient and himself unconscious shame and to not dissociate it from the patient's communication of overwhelming negative affect is key. On shame dynamics. In this traumatic emotional regression, the creative therapist is able to retain an empathic resonance and an interpersonal right brain synchronization with the patient's dysregulation. Note in this moment, the emotionally connected therapist remains down in the right amygdaloidal limbic system and is not defensively shifting up left. The dyadic source of the therapeutic mutual regression of the enactment was the unconscious alignment of both the patient's and the clinician's dissociative defenses to keep the experience of dysregulated strong negative emotions out of the therapeutic relationship. The resolution of the enactment therefore involves each member reducing the affect-blocking defense, simultaneously exposing right brain vulnerability and shame in both members of the dyad. Recall Rake's observation as rational consciousness gives way to the primary process. It may feel as if the ground is threatening to slip away. Bromberg 2017 described his own subjectivity when he becomes aware of the defensiveness and the limitations of his left hemisphere within a stressful rupture and repair of a mutual enactment, surrenders and then shares this self-disclosure with the patient. I could feel my head spinning. Everything that came to mind, I discarded because I could feel my defensiveness and I wanted to hide it from myself as well as from the patient. Self-conscious shame. What to do? It was clear that my cupboard was bare. There was nothing left in it that would work any better. The problem was me, not my ideas. So I stopped searching. Strangely, it didn't feel so bad to give up. And even more strangely, it was at that moment that I could feel an option that I had not felt earlier. I could share my experience of what was going on in my mind. I could share it just because I wanted her to know it, not because it was supposed to lead somewhere. And so I did. I shared my formulation, and I also shared my feelings about my formulation, my private awareness. Bromberg reflected that he had given up searching because he had run out of ideas in order to find a way of just being with the patient. Neurobiology and psychoanalysis can offer insights into this process. Hellman, Nadeau, and Beversdorf asserted a possible method of resolving a previously unsolved problem is to see the problem in a new light, to use a different form of knowledge and a different cognitive strategy that might be mediated by the hemisphere that is opposite to the one previously used. I hope you like this introduction to Allan Schore's book, Right Brain Psychotherapy. I am so glad that there is so much being written about this. Also, Bonnie Badenoch has 2 wonderful books where she talks about the brainwise therapist and the heart of trauma. 2 wonderful, wonderful books I will introduce in the next book quote reading from my Zen Mind balcony.